I'm sure some other folks are going to filter in, but we can go ahead, get started. I want to thank everyone who is here now with us for coming to our session, our first session of 2025 for From the Stacks, Illinois Wesleyan University's Community Book Club. We're so excited to have you here with us. And of course, here with Diego Báez from the class of 2007, as well as our special co-host, Professor Michael Tooney. And we'll get to their intros in just a minute. I do want to go over just a few housekeeping notes first for those of you in the webinar with us. You're viewing this as an audience member, so as I'm sure you can tell, your camera and your microphone are turned off for the time being, but we do want you to be part of this discussion. So please feel free to, on the Zoom toolbar, submit any questions you have, any thoughts throughout the duration of the conversation, and we'll answer them at the end, but also answer them throughout the conversation if they're relevant to kind of what Mike and Diego are discussing. Also, as well as this is technology, if you run into any technical difficulties with sound, camera, as happens sometimes, please check the settings on either Zoom or your device, or if those don't work, there's always the old standby, sign out, try signing back in, and hopefully that does the trick for you. Okay, so I'm excited to introduce our author this evening. Our first poet, Diego Báez, is from the class of 2007. He is a writer, an educator, an abolitionist, and the first Paraguayan American poet to publish a book originally in English in the United States. He lives in Chicago, which they were discussing earlier, and teaches at the city colleges. His debut collection, Yaguareté White, English, Spanish, and Guaraní encounter each other through the elusive yet potent figure of the jaguar, which I'm sure you all read about when you read it. As the son of a Paraguayan father and a mother from Pennsylvania, Báez grew up in central Illinois as one of the only brown kids on the block, but that didn't keep him from feeling like a gringo on family visits to Paraguay. Is exploring this contradiction as it weaves through experiences of language, self, and place. Báez revels in showing up the absurdities of empire and chafes at the limits of patrimony, but he always reserves his most trenchant irony for the gaze he turns on himself, which I think we can all learn from.
Yeah.
And our co-host this evening, we're also very excited to have with us, Professor Michael Tooney has been a faculty member at Illinois Wesleyan for over 22 years. His scholarly work focuses on contemporary US poetry and poetics and on British Romanticism, especially the work of John Keats. He has published 3 books, is Robert Harrington Endowed Professor of English, and is the current chair of the Department of English at Illinois Wesleyan University. So we are in for an excellent conversation. Welcome, Mike. Welcome, Diego. We're thrilled to have you, and I will turn the floor over to the two of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Amy. Thanks so much. Hey, Diego, what a treat it is to get to be with you in this venue.
It is. It is. Thank you for taking the time, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Man, my great pleasure. So, hey, just a couple additional words about to everybody out there about kind of how we're going to proceed. First of all, before we begin, I'll say from myself, I look at the list of participants here, and I'm blown away. There are some good friends and colleagues who have been around, and so it's nice to see all of you. Saw some of you on campus earlier today, but there are some former students on there, and Diego's dad, who I knew decades ago. And so so there are just some figures there. I just want to acknowledge you all and say hello, and how nice it is to at least be connected in this electronic way. And then also, right, yeah, please do. So what Diego's and my plan is to kind of engage in some conversation. We kind of figure we'll go till about like 7:40-ish, and then really kind of turn it into a kind of a larger Q&A, so that if you have specific questions for Diego, we will invite you at that point to really use chat, and we'll really try to kind of pepper Diego with some of those questions and get his responses. But feel free to use chat along the way as well, and I'll do what I can to kind of monitor it. And if you've got something to say along the way, let's have this kind of be a group conversation. We've got a lot of people in this conversation who love literature, love poetry, a couple who love Diego, and so let's have it be all of us engaged in this together. So, but Diego, so let's kind of get things going. So I kind of figure as a way to maybe get things started, thinking about this as an event that's being hosted by the Office of Alumni Engagement, I wonder if you could kind of tell us a little bit about like literally kind of give us a little bit of your journey, right? So, and some of the journey appears in the book, of course, but like, so to tell us about like childhood, growing up in Bloomington Normal, attending Illinois Wesleyan, and then what happened in those years after Illinois Wesleyan, and then before you were working on the book, but then during the book. So a big time span is included in this book. And I wonder if you could just give us a sense of the kind of physical and geographical journey, and then we'll springboard from there.
Yeah, I love that. And I do think that's a great place to start because it can be odd writing poems about childhood, and some of the speakers in the book are children, basically,
Yeah.
and even young adults. And I mean, chronologically, it's very far away, but in my heart and in my mind, in my gut, it still is like right there, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was born and raised in Bloomington Normal.
Yeah.
I was just actually, we were talking about my sister-in-law who teaches at Bloomington High School. I visited her class via Zoom today to talk with some students
Nice.
about the book. And I was worried I wasn't making sense, but she assured me that I cohered a bit.
Right.
But so it was, it's funny to evaluate one's own childhood because you don't really have anything to evaluate it against, except that now my own child, I am so conscious of how different her upbringing is to mine, in the sense that we're here in the city and she's familiar with, the train, the bus, all these things that I did not experience, for better and worse, as a kid. But I decided to go to Illinois Wesleyan after kind of falling in love with literature and falling in love with writing, really in high school, a little bit in middle school, but really in high school. And I remember two very formative influences: Edgar Allan Poe and Eminem.
Good.
And I've spoken about this before elsewhere, but those two, like reading those two totally different writers, artists, however you want to say, at the same time, taught me a lot about what one can do with words and with language. And
Diego, who
yeah.
was the second? Forgive me, I didn't catch it.
Eminem, Slim Shady.
Oh, no, I get okay.
Yeah,
I'm reeling. Okay,
yeah.
all right,
I
good.
know, I
Good.
know. At the time, I was in like seventh or eighth grade when his first album came out, and I probably shouldn't have been listening to that, but I did, and I learned a lot. Especially about rhyme scheme, not
Yeah.
just about like end rhyme and slant rhyme and variations thereof, but especially that you could rhyme in the middle of lines, and you can stack them. And I just remember circling the rhymes and just having my mind blown.
Yeah.
But so when I did come to Illinois Wesleyan, I decided I wanted to study English, and I was also very interested in philosophy and religion, my religion courses as well. And I'm so grateful for both the freedom to explore those disciplines, as well as the ability to kind of figure out what was working and what wasn't. So over the course of my time, I I realized that some of my strengths were in some areas more so than others, right? And so while I didn't pursue like a major in philosophy, for example, I still think about, like, to this day, actually, it literally came up at a party. These are the kind of parties I go to. It
Yeah.
came up at a party. We were talking about symbolic logic.
Yeah.
And I took symbolic logic with Mark Criley.
Of
And
course. Oh, yes.
yeah. And I think about that course all the time and the things
Good.
that I learned there. Um, but I guess I should say, because I think my folks are on the call, that both of my parents also went to Illinois Wesleyan.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And yeah, and I remember much later seeing a photo of my dad's dorm room when he stayed in the I House, International House,
Sure. Yeah.
where I was able also to, I lived there my sophomore year, I want to say it was, my second
Yeah.
year. And it was so funny to see a room that looked so familiar. I mean, it was one of the rooms in the house there, but his room, it was like comedically over the top, decked out with plants. And of course, I've got these here. It was like
Right.
a jungle in there. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that's so fitting and so odd and so like lovely to see that snapshot into that past and that like genealogy. But uh, I decided after graduating from Illinois Wesleyan that I should probably get a job. So I moved to the Chicagoland suburbs to work at a web agency.
Right.
And it was actually a web agency owned by my aunt and uncle on my mom's side. And I learned so much. And I had a little laptop station at my uncle's desk. And he was, making deals and writing contracts and just I learned so much about how businesses work just sitting there observing um, that I'm so grateful for that experience. I also learned very quickly that it wasn't for me. And that's okay. Like that's
Right.
part of, you try
Yeah.
things out, you're grateful for them, and then you try to pursue a different path. And I I decided to back to poetry school or go to poetry school. And Mike, you helped me with that process. And I don't know if
I
you
love
remember this.
that.
I'm going to put
Yeah.
myself on blast here a little bit because I sent you my letter of like interest. And this is just like a testament to the power of like a good friend and also a positively critical, like in a good way, mentor. Because I sent my letter and you wrote back and you said, "Is this a joke?" And I said, "Okay, help me make this not a joke." And you did. And I'm very grateful for that because you could have been like, sure, fix this and send it out. But
Wow.
you called me out and you were like, "Diego, you need to take this seriously because it is serious."
Thank you. Thank you for remaining a friend of mine after a response like that, Diego. Oh,
No,
wow.
I mean, it made all
Wow.
the difference because the the schools that I decided to apply for grad school, I applied to Rutgers
Yeah.
in Newark
Yep.
because one of the faculty members sounded like someone I'd be interested in, Rigoberto
Yeah.
Gonzalez,
Yeah.
and the school appeared on the list of up and coming MFA programs
Right.
published by The Atlantic at the time, I think.
Right.
And I didn't learn until I got there that they hadn't graduated a single class. I was the second class of students.
Wow. Great. Yeah. Yeah.
And so like I actually like that it's kind of scrappy, it's kind of figuring out what we are, what it's doing. And it was I have no regrets about going to poetry school. I have some
Yeah.
regrets about how I spent some of my time, but
Of
also
course. Yeah.
I'm very
Yep.
grateful for that. And I know we'll come back to some of the childhood stuff in the
Of
poems as well,
course.
but like that's kind of the broad stroke.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, Diego. So but then woven throughout then that is right. So you're telling this story of kind of an American physical geographical journey, but of course then woven into this is then your association and affiliation with Paraguay.
Yeah.
And so can you and so a number of childhood visits, and it sounds like visits when you were a teenager. Did those visits continue then, Diego, when you were, and it sounds as though there was from the book, it sounds like there was perhaps at least a visit maybe when you were either engaged or when you were married. Can you say something a little bit about that trajectory of the role that Paraguay played in that trajectory?
Absolutely. My whole life has been punctuated by visits to Paraguay, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah.
I'm aware of it's sort of a paradox of privilege because my father flew to this country as an exchange student.
Yeah.
And that is I'm not saying it's easy. I don't imagine it was. I'm not going to do that. It was very difficult. But it's also very different to folks who are walking and running and climbing and
Yeah.
making their way across the border. And so, in an odd way, it was a privilege for me and my brothers and my family to be able to visit Paraguay. Basically, every 2, 3, 4 years, we would return as a
Right.
family, and like that became just part of my normal.
Yeah.
Um, and I learned so much about the world and about myself and about my family, obviously visiting them. They're all still there. I mean, dozens of them by now because
Yeah.
it's my primates and their kids and etc. And it did continue through high school into college and even even into through grad school in my working life. And in fact, actually now, this is the longest I've gone since returning. My last
Okay.
visit was it was February of 2020. And the coronavirus had become a thing, but borders weren't closed, or the airports weren't closed. And I remember standing in the airport in Asuncion, like kind of distant, but we didn't know about social distancing, wasn't really a thing yet, but kind of just trying not to be close to anybody, hearing someone cough
Right,
and kind of
right.
looking suspiciously. And it was literally after I landed that Sunday, by Friday, they had
Yeah,
they had closed the college where I work. That's
right,
when things were shutting down. And I
right.
haven't been
Okay.
back
Yeah.
since.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah. Diego, how long would a typical visit be to Paraguay? Is it like 2 weeks?
So like now, yes, like that would be a pretty long trip. Even 1 week is pushing it because it's a long journey. I mean, you got
It
to take
is, yeah.
a couple flights, you got to drive for a while or find someone to pick you up or take a bus.
Yeah.
But back in the day when we were kids, and I appreciate this now as the father of one child.
Yeah.
So I'm one of three brothers, and when we would go down, we'd go down for like a month. And I remember very well packing one of the checked pieces of luggage was a big cooler full of snacks and food and stuff like that we would eat while we were down there, cereal and granola bars and fruit snacks and whatnot. And so we'd go down and like basically live there for a month on the farm where my father grew up and where my abuela and abuela lived until they passed with
Yeah.
relatively recently, like within the last 5 or 10 years or so. And so that was, and it was such a trip because we'd go during the winter break, the winter holidays, and as many people on the call know, Central Illinois in the middle of winter, cold, not a lot of sun. Go down there and it's beautiful, it's hot, it's almost too hot.
Right. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
but then returning, it was not quite reverse culture shock because that doesn't really apply, but coming back and being like, tanned and having been immersed in Spanish language and then just being dropped right back in winter of Illinois, it was just so striking, right? And I will
Indeed.
never forget that. And I think a lot of that did make it into the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Diego, there's even so thank you for that. There's even so a little bit more, and then I promise everybody in a minute or two, I want to get us to turn to a poem and have Diego share a poem and dive into that a little bit. But I'm thinking a little bit about kind of this journey, and so but also about kind of a little bit your own inner development. One of the things that I love about this book is that it you can feel these changes in so the speaker is essentially this kind of a fairly self-aware adult, but some of the stories the speaker talks about being young or and some of the emotional states about some of the embarrassment about kind of family members early on, and then of course the transformation that occurs in the book to then just those gorgeous poems at the end of the book to your wife and to your daughter, right? Where it's just like that familial love. It marks quite a journey. And what's striking to me, I really kind of appreciate it. I don't know, just kind of there's something about being a young man in this book and kind of acknowledging just the weirdness of that. And I think that there's a kind of a sense of maybe kind of gratitude for having kind of made it out of some of that baloney.
Yeah, yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
fair?
Oh yeah, for sure. I felt very, um, I felt like I was the only person having that experience in the
Yeah, yeah,
world when I was
yeah,
young,
yeah,
with the exception of my brothers. And for so many of the poems, they were like not physically with me, but metaphorically with me as I wrote them, and even as I read them. And I was actually shocked right before the book went to print. I did a final kind of read through, and I was shocked how many of the poems were not in first person plural because I that's how I imagined them. That's how I
right.
figured them, but they
Right,
weren't.
right.
And this is I think a lot of poets do this. We borrow and we fabricate and we fictionalize and we make things up. And so a lot of what is in the book were my experiences, but some of them were my brothers, or some things that happened to me I displaced onto the brother figure in the book. And I
Right.
kind of consolidated. They're both my brothers are younger than me, but we're all very close in age. And
Yeah.
I kind of consolidated the two brothers into one, uh, just because it was easier and I didn't know,
Yeah, yeah,
didn't know how to
sure.
do it the other way.
Yeah,
But I think you're absolutely right that it is, and I'm grateful in some ways that the book didn't come out until it did, in the sense that I didn't have quite that same scope of perspective to, I guess, appreciate, as maybe you're suggesting,
yeah,
just how unique that journey was, but then also
yeah,
to come of my own age and realize that there are actually lots of folks who have similar, if not the same, experiences.
yeah,
And I couldn't have written half the poems in the book 10 years ago, 15
yeah.
years ago,
Wow.
you know?
Yeah,
And yeah.
yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. So let's turn to a poem. Would you do you mind reading something for us, Diego? And maybe we
I
can
would
look
love
at a
to.
poem. Would you read is it regalito?
Yeah.
Regalito?
Yeah. Regalito. Yep.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, regalito means little, like a little gift in Spanish. And
Beautiful. On yeah, so we're on page, if people have the book, we're on page 7.
yep, page 7. Regalito. Some immigrants stuff language into duffel bags like contraband. Other children never learn to handle the baggage of their claim. When I asked my father why he didn't teach us Spanish, he says he tried, but that my brothers and I always squirmed and whined. I do remember dreading the militant insistence my father placed on our response to his calls. Si, papi, he'd have us parrot, which I guess is a question or maybe an affirmation. Like maybe finding the breathless body of his infant brother when he was 5 broke him. So maybe the sound of our voices singing our inheritance, this tongue of ours, grants a succession of his name, our house. But I do remember asking my father more than once how to say something silly in Spanish, like coaster or roller coaster. From the driver's seat of that minivan, I'm sure of it, he answered, there's not a word for that.
Oh, 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 amazing, wonderful. Thank you, Diego. Yeah, right. So there's that young man. Thank you, Valerie. Yeah, there's that young man, right? The boys just kind of like, oh, we don't, right? Embarrassment about the language and about all of this, right? But then even the beautiful efforts at kind of even then the speaker here, this composite speaker kind of right, but kind of saying, but wait, okay, occasionally asking questions and then mostly kind of getting batted down by the again the kind of created father of this poem of like, no, there's just not, we're not going to get into that now. Those dynamics are just wonderful.
Yeah, and complicated and
Yeah,
fraught and like you suggest, invented a bit,
yeah, yeah,
to be fair to
yeah,
the real figures. But yeah.
yeah, yeah. Why that title, Diego?
Hmm. I, when I was writing the poems, I didn't imagine them being in a book. It wasn't until much later, but still kind of a long time ago, like 2018, 17, 18, 19. I think actually would have been one of the first times you would have seen the manuscript as a whole, and it changed a great deal since then, because my kid was born.
Right.
But once I started to see the poems in conversation with each other, it occurred to me that there were some themes that were emerging, themes of inheritance and lineage and legacy and language, obviously. But then also this, it didn't really cohere until my child was born because I hadn't thought about legacy in any meaningful fashion. It just was not important to me for better or worse. But then now I start to think about these things that not only things and people and livelihoods that I'm putting into the world physically, but also like artistically. And I think a lot recently about the bidirectionality of inheritance, not just what we pass down to our children, and not just sort of what we have inherited from our ancestors, but also the things that we take from our children. And I see that a lot in the poems that I've written for my child. Like I couldn't have written those without her. Like I owe those to her and to Sarah, my wife, but also like my dad. Like that poem doesn't happen without him, decades ago being a frustrated immigrant
Yeah,
father trying to teach his like Americano kids
yeah,
some Spanish and us just not having it.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, and you kind of have to laugh a little bit, I think.
Undoubtedly, though, we're going to get to that in a little. The laughter is crucial here. Can we? But yeah, as maybe a way into that, maybe using this poem or thinking a little bit more generally, I'm interested in kind of the ethos of, again, kind of the voice of this book, or again, kind of the speaker of this book, and the way that the speaker is kind of positioned, right? Like I think about, in the first poem, the speaker says, right, "Don't worry, I don't know how to pronounce it either." It's such a fascinating thing that happens in this book. And a number of commentators have kind of talked about it in their discussions of this book, about how it's both a book kind of about kind of identity, but also and acknowledging an identity, but also I think it's being honest enough to kind of know the limits of that, or even to be ironic about it. And in an interview that you gave, you kind of talked about this feeling of both authenticity and fraudulence, right? This wavering back and forth. It's a really powerful, I don't know, technique or a position for this speaker. When was that something you knew about right away? Did that dawn on you? How'd you come across that voice?
Yeah, there is for sure some degree of racial treachery, let's say, or like ethnic treachery at play, because it
Yeah,
is also how I have experienced
yeah,
whiteness and
yeah,
Latinidad.
yeah,
And I- as a short tangent, one of the most influential figures during my time in grad school, again, for better and worse,
yeah.
was David Foster Wallace. And he passed away. I remember the day he passed away because my poetry professor, Rachel Hadas, a brilliant poet,
Yeah.
just kind of mentioned that this thing had happened. And certainly at that point, I had heard of him, but I hadn't read a word.
Mhm. Yeah.
And as soon as she said that, it really struck me. As I was in a kind of a sensitive, vulnerable spot. Grad school it's a lot of things, and I was feeling a lot of things. So I decided to read some of his work. And
Yeah.
within the pursuing year, within the next year, I had read everything that he had published.
Oh,
And again, for better and worse. But it helped me to understand the interplay, the dance between authenticity and ironic distance, and
yeah.
how actually sometimes it can be, I think, more effective to get at a truth by giving it a little bit of distance, by being a little bit of sardonic about one's own identity and one's own positionality. And so then when that comes to poems
Yeah.
the title poem, that sentence that you quoted, or that line rather, is not true. Like I do know how to pronounce, like
Right, right.
me,
Yeah.
Diego, I know how to pronounce a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
it.
Sure.
That's not really the point. The point is to try
Yeah.
to navigate what it means to translate and interpret one's own experience, my own experience, through the lyricism of the poem. And it's been so rewarding to hear from and talk with other individuals who feel like especially seen by some of the poems that try to do that kind of
Yeah.
tightrope walk. Yeah.
It's impressive stuff. I read in an interview that you gave, Diego, that actually, I hope I'm not giving away too much, but that you talked about how in graduate school that you kind of had almost two separate collections going on, the
Yeah.
blue and the brown books.
Yeah.
And then would you say a little bit about that? And then and then if some of those poems made their way into the book, how that happened?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And
Yeah.
I know you're familiar with the brown and blue and brown books. I didn't encounter them myself until grad school but I had heard about them previously from a friend who's also
So
from,
we're talking about the
yeah,
Wittgenstein
yeah,
books of philosophy, the blue and the
yes,
brown books. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And my friend Kyle Ferguson, who is also a townie from Bloomington Normal, and we actually reconnected. This short tangent. We reconnected recently in New York after like over 10 years of not seeing each other, and it was really beautiful. But
Yeah.
he had put out an album. It's on Spotify. Everyone should check it out. It's so beautiful. He's like a legit philosopher now in New York, but he had put out an album called The Blue and Brown Books, and I was inspired by that. I really liked the sound of it, and I am not going to pretend like I understand Wittgenstein, but I liked reading about it and like trying to kind of take a poetic license version of it. But so, right, I had written my thesis was the blue and brown books. There was two halves, blue books, brown books. Blue books were like language poems or playing with language and punctuation, and not so much like shape or concrete poems, but really language. I was called a language poet by Jericho Brown, who had visited one of our before he was like Jericho Brown TM, but was kind of on his way there. But he had visited our workshop class and said that about one of my poems. And I remembered that, and I wrote a poem about that. But the blue books were like language related, or like the interplay of that. And the brown books were about identity and about my time in Paraguay and about my family. And a thesis is not a manuscript, but my mentor Rigoberto, he said one of the most important things that I could have heard, which was like, Diego, I see what you're doing here. This is not you. Like, combine this. Your book is both of these together.
Beautiful. And so, and that's what, I mean, crazily, Diego, like that's what this book feels like. It feels like, right, precisely those kind of experimental kind of forays, plus this real concern about identity, but such an authentic concern that it's like, it doesn't rest easily on some asserted identity. It really is a kind of, right, an honest wavering, right, of multiple identities and a really intersectional identity. But it's amazing how that book kind of really combines those, right? You know, kind of a hybrid poetry, or kind of these mixed modes. It's really, it's powerful in that way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Diego, one of the things that emerges from that, I think that it might also kind of emerge from that combination. One of the effects of it, and it's not the only effect, but one of the effects is comedy. There are places where you juxtapose these things, and comedy emerges, but also comedy just clearly seems to be part of the conversations you're a part of. Kind of, can you say a bit about how comedy makes its way in this book, and your interest in it, and how that works and how it operates?
Oh, absolutely. I should probably prepare a whole job talk about this topic, because it is one that I am so interested in. I think from a very young age, I began to adopt humor and comedy as a sort of defense mechanism, but also as just like a so my child's in kindergarten now, and I see them beginning to like really interact with each other and build their own little, I won't call it a coalition, that's not the right word, friendship, I think is the word. But they're building society. Like, they are becoming society. And as I was kind of figuring out who I wanted to be as a person in the world, humor seemed to work, and to either defuse situations or to deflect sometimes, for sure, but also to connect with other people, right? I also, though, I'm very interested in the structure of jokes. I'm interested in the form of a joke, which to all of the people who are on the call, you should check out a little book published about 15 years ago, called Structure and Surprise.
I've heard of it.
By Michael Tooney. But that really was, I'm serious. That really changed it both streamlined and complicated my understanding of what poems can do. Because when I start to apply this way of reading poems, I realized that, so many poems, they have a setup and they have to deliver something that is both surprising and fitting, which sounds easy. I'm not doing justice to the thesis of your book, but it can be so effective for structuring a poem. And so then, like, the third way that I hope that the humor or the comedy works in the book is not just as some of the poems are pretty clearly structured as like, here's the setup, here's the punchline, but then to kind of go a little meta with it, and to have jokes that are both maybe funny, but also some that are not, and some that are supposed to be incomprehensible as well. There's a whole sequence. So there's 3 different jokes that have the setup in English, the setup is in Guaraní, and the punchlines are in English or omitted, or they're in like the aftermatter. And nobody's really asked me about those, but I'm so fascinated by this idea that, like, that's not how jokes work usually. Like, jokes, if they're in 2 languages, you assume that the people who are reading them or hearing them speak both languages. That's not the case for most people who read Yaguareté White. It's not the case for me either. And so I was trying to do something a little different to maybe frustrate or invert that like setup punchline, because I do think it becomes complicated when you introduce the new dimension of like multiplicity of languages. It can become confusing.
It's hilarious. With some of those jokes, I found myself like having to turn back to your notes section to kind of be like, and then What is interesting though, Diego, is that I felt as though as I was reading the book, I felt as though I was learning language a little bit along the way. I was like, okay, I think I get that joke. But it was that frustration of humor and feeling that frustration palpably because I know the experience that a joke should give me, and then I'm not getting it, right? Like, so yeah, you frustrate it nicely, I think, with that. But Dio, would you mind reading a poem of yours that for me just has, it's not laugh out loud, but I just love the final image so much. Would you read Abuelo de Laus's Mister?
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
Um, and so, as you know, Mike and others, that a lot of poems are based in fact, a lot are just invented. This is one of the poems in the book. I hope most of them gesture towards truth, but this one is basically just an accounting of a thing that I saw. But so it's called Abuelo de Laus's Mister. Uh, Rubber hose in one hand, pumping with the other, Abuelo douses the poor mutt in kerosene as Ponchito and Paola, emerald-bodied parakeets, shrug shoulders and fall into fits of laughter, shaking hands and slapping one another on the back. My brothers and I stand there aghast, like straight men or suckers, like three gringo amigos made up, like mariachis.
uh, Sorry, I adore Martin Short. I
Yeah.
adore Steve Martin, and I'll take Chevy Chase occasionally. But this idea of using the
Yeah.
three amigos
Yeah.
at the end of it to try to kind of articulate your sense of like the strangeness of that moment and how unfitting it was for you three to be watching that, like again, as this how aghast, but how totally unprepared you are to meet that moment with anything. It's like, yeah, here's the image. It's so do you mind saying, do you remember how like that came to you? Was that an ongoing joke with you and your brother, the three brothers? Was that part, or no? Did that come through in the writing process? Where does a joke
Yeah.
like that come up from?
Yeah, no, this is a great opportunity to talk about that because it's kind of three separate things. The first was the event itself, which was something that my brothers and I watched, and
Yeah.
then this isn't a poem, but we kind of looked at each other like, that's wild.
Yeah, Diego. So just
Yeah.
Mr. lived through that process.
Oh
Mr.
yes, many
survived.
times.
Mr. Okay.
Poor Mister, but yes.
Okay.
Just such
Yeah.
a hilarious name for a Paraguayan dog. It's
Amazing. Amazing.
and you know, people in different countries do things differently.
Yeah. Yep.
And we just kind of chalked it up to that.
Yep.
The second part of it was the parrots,
Yeah.
the parakeets. They lived for so long, and they were a
Yeah.
staple of our visits. In fact, I wish I could have worked them more into the book. They make a couple of appearances, but like these two beautiful green birds that lived over many, many visits, and then there was one, and then eventually there was none. But they were wild. They weren't obviously I'm anthropomorphizing them in the poem. But they have big gesticulations. They are
Yeah.
loud. They can kind of sound like people cackling, which is fun and scary sometimes.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until like I had those two pieces for a
Yeah.
long time. I mean, we're talking years.
Yeah.
And it was relatively close to when I was ready to kind of put the book out there to publishers that I needed some other piece to fit in the end. And this idea of kind of co-opting the pop culture reference and
Yeah.
almost using it as a kind of drag, like the
Yeah.
most, I think, forward version of that I can kind of, there's a couple in the book, but like pulling on the identity or the outfit, the disguise really that felt the closest to appropriate, but still, as you say, so totally out of place to just kind of end in a shoulder shrug that is a little more than just a shoulder shrug. Like it's also this nod to like a very iconic image that is
Yeah.
silly, and it's also supposed to be kind of upsetting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is all of those things. Yeah. Yeah, kind of drag at the end. That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wild. Yeah. Thanks. Crazy little poem. Diego, it's interesting. So even just looking at these two poems that we looked at, right? Like to think about
Mm.
that first poem, right? Long line couplets. This one, right? A single stanza. Prose poems in this, right? Blog posts, pretty, you know, kind of more what one would expect from contemporary American poetry. Just the amount of forms in here is pretty wild. Where does that kind of, was it just the material talking to you for that formal diversity, or yeah, what role does formal diversity play in this book?
Yeah, thank you for that question because I love this question. I was not always a fan of formal poetry, but I
Yeah.
came to it actually, I mean, during my time at Illinois Wesleyan for sure, but specifically one May term, it must have been my second or third year. I did a May term course with Matt Gannett, who was
Wow,
visiting,
yeah, good.
and we did some really. I think that was the first time I encountered Huzzles, and
Yeah.
gosh, I still remember sitting on the quad doing some free writing, and you were kind of scrolling by and sat down, and Matt was there as well, and we were looking at a flag on a flagpole and deciding how to describe it. And I think we landed on flaccid, which felt appropriate at the time.
Sounds sounds like a Matt Gannett
Yeah.
moment. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Yeah.
But then really in grad school, it was completely ramped up by my time with Rachel Hadas, who is a
Yeah.
brilliant formal poet. And I took
Yeah.
the whole workshop was a different form every week.
Yeah.
And I
Beautiful.
am so grateful for that experience because there are forms that I learned that I did not like. Ballads were one of them at the time. I did not have any time for a ballad. But like, I'm so grateful for experimenting with them. And now coming back to them as as an older person, I can appreciate that I can take what I want from a form and kind of change it. And so doing what
Yeah.
I want with that, I'm also obsessed with syllabics. And so there are just a couple of the
Yeah.
poems that are like obsessively architected syllabically that
Oh,
nobody cares about, but I think it
I
kind of
didn't.
come through in the hearing of it, the listening
Yeah.
for it. And I will say one of my biggest like I'm most self-conscious, I think, at least right before the book or as it was kind of coming out last year, I was paging through it and I was kind of getting self-conscious about the fact that there is such formal variety because it's all over the place.
Yeah.
But then, you only get to put out a first book once.
That's
And
right.
I
Yeah.
just felt like, why not kind of stretch and try some
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And and I'm not saying anything that any other creative writer or student won't already know, but that is that forms can give such freedom in constraint because
Yeah.
once you're forced to kind of fit some things in different ways, you make discoveries, or I make discoveries that I wouldn't have otherwise made.
Yeah.
And that I for sure is reflected in a lot of them, in a lot of the poems in the book. But then also like I guess it's a question of form, but the kind of imitating the blog posts, imitating sort of like entries in a diary or like a dictionary or like the list poems. I just got so much out of writing those, and they served me so well that I read a lot of books where poets do kind of the same thing throughout, and I'm impressed by
Yeah.
that too. Because like, how do you?
Sure.
What was it? Diane Seuss's book
Oh,
of sonnets,
Frank.
Frank, which
Oh,
is like, how are you doing this, you
yeah.
magician? This is not
Yeah.
fair. It's like
Yeah.
the same thing over and over, but it's not.
Yeah.
But yeah, so just giving myself some room to kind of grow and experiment and make new discoveries, I think was really the benefits of the form.
Yeah. Beautiful. Everybody, where then Amy just appeared. Look at that. Like, yeah. So I want to. So I have my list continues. Of course, it does. Everybody here who knows me knows that I could go on, and I love this. So, but I also want to make sure that we open things up. So I hope people will use chat, or Amy, if there are other ways for people to kind of raise a question and enter the conversation. We'd love to have that. Perhaps as we could, I'd be happy to kind of, I have a couple more things we could do that. And while chat's kind of getting filled up, we can turn to that. Is that an okay way of proceeding, Amy?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have a few questions
Oh,
for
great.
Diego.
Okay. Oh, great.
I'm gonna be completely selfish here and ask my question first
Yeah.
because I think it pertains to a topic that you were just talking about prior to. I didn't want to jump in too quick because I knew we were getting close to the Q&A.
Yeah.
But going back a little bit to the poem about Mr., which I think is maybe the one that stands out to me the most because I think it's a very vivid image, and again, it has that humor to it. And that we talk about the jaguar is in some ways, the centerpiece of the book, and that's what the first poem about, the title poem is about. But there are so many other instances of animals uh, throughout featured.
Yeah.
The toucans, the dog, I'm trying to think of other ones, panther. And I'm curious about what those other animals symbolize to you, and if you've always been drawn to writing about them, how do they feel like an extension of you in that
Mhm.
way, or what is it that compels you to keep writing about them?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Amy. That's a good one. I think most of my interest in writing about any kind of animals comes from my visits to Paraguay because the wildlife is so different and because they have different relationships with domesticated animals for sure. That those kind of cultural like riffs or those kind of cultural sort of headbutts, I think are worth writing about. But also, honestly, from what poets call research, which is usually Wikipedia, or now I guess now ChatGPT. I don't know. I don't it's a different topic for a different day. But when I learned so much more about the kinds of animals that inhabit or inhabited Paraguay, I became obsessed. And the more I learned, the more poems I found, or like the more poetry I saw. And so capybaras are very interesting to me. There's a book in the poem, there's a poem in the book about capybaras who didn't always, but as of recently, at least 5 years ago, and I think even our last trip before that, just hang out and live. There are some that live in Villarrica, like in this little square, this little park around a pond. And they're wild animals. They're so gentle. They're huge. And
Yeah.
you can kind of just go right up to them and be like, this is wild. Like literally just living out there. But also, this actually started back at Illinois Wesleyan. I wrote a chapbook for a class. I'm sure it was one of yours, Mike, a class where one of the assignments was to end with a chapbook, and I wrote a chapbook called Pig. And I think that was actually one of the first times where I realized, like, or I felt like taking an emblem like that can serve as a portal to a whole wider discussion
Yeah.
about all kinds of things, artistic, discussion of all kinds of things, but always using it to kind of recenter the conversation or the lyrics. And it's funny with the Jaguar with this book. I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't, but Rosebud Ben-Oni, a brilliant Jewish Mexican American poet, read an early version of the manuscript, and it had a different title. It was called Valleys Full of Jaguars, which was a quote from a Cesar Aeda novel, Ama, I think it is. But Rosebud was like, Diego, there are no jaguars in your book. You need a different title. I was like, okay, fair.
Oh.
I was like, that's part of the point. I was trying to be ironic, but it's not landing. I got it. And that's when I changed the title and then wrote the title poem, which came very quickly. That is not usually the case for me, but that
Crazy, yeah.
came very quickly. And then I found other opportunities to kind of work in or suggest or allude to panthers or jaguars. And then again, like actually, I'm not kidding. Like the research that I did learned about the fact that there aren't any or haven't been for decades wild jaguars in Paraguay, which is sad, but it's also, to me, I find that sad, but it's also part of climate change and the logging industry. Same, so too, though, my mom's home state
Yeah.
of Pennsylvania, there used to be wildcats that lived up there. Like there's colonial records of that. And that's just like a wild mirror that I can't let go of. And there's
Yeah.
more of that didn't make it into the book, but that's probably for another poem.
We'll do
It
that
is
next discussion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Amy, thanks for that. Yeah, it's interesting to think about this book that is so much about, right, human translation, different cultures, but that it real, right, any theorist who's interested in kind of animal theory could also really think about the human as animal, the human with the animal. Yeah, it's the animal presence in this book is yeah, pretty clear here. So
Yeah.
yeah, great. You have a couple of questions here, Diego, that where so Val says, kind of the fact that you mentioned drawing
Mm.
inspiration from your daughter, right? So, and your wife, but how about fellow artists or poets for inspiration? And Evan as well asks, like, who are some of your favorite poets?
Mm.
Yeah, do you mind talking about kind of you've mentioned Poe and Marshall Mathers, but who are you reading these days? Who's intriguing you?
Yeah, for sure. Oh my God. I mean, the list goes on. I love reading debut books because I love knowing what's going on. And a lot more, this is not my situation, but a lot of poets will come out of undergrad or even like graduate school or even undergrad with a book that they put out through a reputable press. And I'm just so impressed with like what these youngsters are able to do. But I know I mentioned Diane Seuss, but also This is not a contemporary poet, but Jorge Andrade Carrera is an Ecuadorian, or was an Ecuadorian poet who I cite in the book. He writes these microgramas, these tiny little, they're not haikus, but they're just brilliant. What he can do in like 10 syllables is breathtaking. But there are so many. I guess if I had to recommend just a small handful, Diamond Sharp wrote a book 2 years ago, I think, Super Sad Black Girl. I highly recommend it. What she does with just the architecture of the book as a whole blows my mind. Jordan Perez, Santa Tarantula came out last year, I believe it was last year. Same, actually, very similarly. The poems are knockout, but then also how they connect with each other is just floors me. Um, Also, Cindy Cruz is a poet who I worked with in grad school, and I think she's in Germany doing a PhD on something very complicated and intense. But she comes out with a book like once a year or once every other year, and they're all bangers. So I highly recommend Cindy Cruz. This could go on for much longer, but
Oh, good.
I'll
Yeah.
leave you, I'll leave you with those three, I think, because
Yeah.
those are all great recs.
Do you find yourself, Diego, is it fair to say when you're writing, do you feel in conversation with these, right? Like, how does do you feel when you are actually writing? Well, yeah, do you feel in conversation with them? How does the inspiration work?
For sure,
So
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
It's a double-edged sword because I'll
yeah,
read a book or a new poem or whatever and feel terribly inspired. I'll feel like this is okay, great. Like this makes me want to write. And I have had the exact opposite where I'll read a book and I'll just put it down. Like what did I just read? Karen Rigby has a book either coming out or came out last year called Fabulosa. And it was like 12 years since her first book, and this is her second book. And I read it and I put it down. And I kind of just slid it off to the side, and I said, I don't. I think that's it. I don't know that I need to write anything anymore. It's
right,
so
right,
good. But yeah, it's like that push and pull always,
yeah,
always, always.
yeah.
I do
Diego,
have
it looks like,
I
yeah,
was just going to say, this is something that I've like to ask our other authors, and this is a very standard basic question. You've talked about your inspirations, you've talked about who you're reading now. You have one book. Do you have one favorite book?
Oh
What
boy.
is it? I know. What a question to ask a writer.
cruel.
I know.
Oh yeah, that is such a good one.
And
Okay. I will say this. It's not my favorite book, but it is the book that if I were on a desert island, I would probably take it with me just because I can return to it probably forever, and it would sustain me if I needed to start a fire.
Right.
Infinite Jest is
Infinite
such
Jest, of course, of
it's,
course.
it's such
definitely
a
then build a good fire.
yeah, and it's such a time capsule though too. I mean, I worked with one of my editors at Booklist, Donna Seaman, who also has a book out, River of Books, recently, but she didn't get it. She's never gotten it. She's like, I don't know, I think it's like a young man's, I think it's like a white guy's thing. And she's right. It absolutely is. But if you can see it for its limitations and still dive into the characters and the heart and the language and the creativity and the problems, I think that could sustain me for a little while on a desert island. Yeah.
Love that. Yeah.
Hmm.
Diego, you have a question from Valeria. Hi, Valeria. It's so nice to see your name pop up here. Valeria's right. You paint a complex relationship to an American identity, right? And that end of Autonym, talk about a great ending, that both comedic but hard-hitting, great ending, right? What do we call ourselves? You say Dios, right? Anything but that to Americano, right? But that's contrasted to being called Americano by your uncle and being primo Americana by being a native English speaker, right? So just kind of back to this kind of idea about asking about how would you describe your American and Paraguayan identities, right?
Yeah.
From a fellow native foreigner.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, this is a nice way to tie in the other part of Evan's question,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
about negative
sure.
capability
Yeah,
and uh, uh, defining things by what they are not and being not only comfortable in that, but thriving and exploiting that, I would say, was something that I had been doing evidently for the entire time writing this book. Didn't really realize it until the manuscript went out for some blurbs from other authors. And Daniel Borzutsky, who is a poet who I very greatly admire,
yeah.
was very kind to provide a blurb, and he named it exactly that. He was like, "This is a poetry of not knowing," and it struck me because I was like, "Oh my God, yeah, that's exactly what this whole thing, my whole endeavor is with the book." And I couldn't have named that myself, which is a it's odd when that happens. Same thing, I think, to kind of claiming the title of Americano. Like, I will never forget this. One of the things that my dad has said, I don't know, a lot of parents are like this. They'll like say something randomly and it's like the most profound thing, and then you go back to talking about chores or whatever. But I remember asking him one time, probably over the nightly news, why like why he decided to come to America or something. And he, without missing a beat, he was like, I was born in America. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, I had never thought about the concept of America in that way.
Yeah.
And certainly over the last the last 12 years, like many people, I've ping-ponged back and forth between feeling great pride and privilege and gratitude being born in this country and having the life that I have, and deep shame and reservations and just wanting to escape. And I think that both have to live together. They have to cohabitate within the poet, within myself, within my life and the lyrics. So far as that last line goes, I got a little pushback from one of my early readers, Jeff Martin. He's a Canadian, primarily nonfiction writer, and he wanted to he wanted the speaker to kind of acknowledge that, but actually you are like Americano, the speakers are, and it's in jest, right? Like the last,
Sure.
it's kind of trying to shrug off that identity while realizing like the shackles aren't going anywhere, and that's just part of, I think, living in
Yeah.
a nation state.
Yeah. I mean, you get right. So like, yeah, if you were being like if you were testifying in a court of law, the line might have to be something like Dios, anything but just that, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like, no, right. But it's like, it's way funnier, it's way more propulsive, it's way more to just right, it is funny, it is, and so assertive and great. So yeah, no, you can't
And the whole poem, or part of the poem, is about seeing metaphor. And
yeah,
as Diego, I truly believe it. I think this country needs nothing more than the ability to
yeah,
see
it's amazing.
similarities between things,
Yeah.
but then for the
Yep.
speaker to be like totally undercut that, I think,
Yeah.
part of it too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're right at 8 o'clock. I'll encourage if there are any last minute questions that folks want to get in, or if you have any burning questions, Mike, I know we could honestly talk for another hour about this, another 2 hours. Yeah, but I think this has been such a dynamic, engaging conversation. And I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I just have enjoyed listening to your perspectives and being able to hear your thought process behind your work. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your bit of your story with us. And thank you,
Yeah.
Mike, for serving as our co-host.
My great pleasure. Thank you. What a treat it was to dive back into Diego's terrific book, and to think about that, and then to get to the privilege of having this conversation, and to know that these good souls are behind these names that I recognize here. What a treat all of this has been. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing this together, Amy. This is like a dream. So thank you.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. And for anyone who wants to rewatch, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel tomorrow. And then will also have more authors coming up in the year. So please check your emails, because we will be peppering you with more emails about more great alumni authors. Again, and thank you for coming to our first session of From the Stacks for 2025. Yeah, everyone have a great night.
Thanks, so.
Thank you.